This is our last hybrid session of the evening, and I want us to make sure that we've got all the energy to really hype up and welcome our amazing panelist and moderator as we explore the evolution and the revolution of psychedelics and pharmaceuticals. So, round of applause and enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Yes, this is the last session of the day, saving the best for last. That's us. And Lars, you as well. It's really exciting to be here in a hybrid session because this really is the future, this idea that we can be both digital and physical at the same time. And what we're here to discuss is very much the future. My name is Katherine Templar. I'm a presenter, speaker. I'm the co-founder of a studio called Kinder Studios, and we work at accelerating science out of the labs and into the public domain. And about 10 years ago, I was working for Vice magazine, and I first heard about sort of psychedelics being used for research into mental illness. And it was so radical at the time, and it was sort of surrounded in stigma. And there are still challenges, and it is still very radical and progressive. But I'm very honored to be joined today in this discussion of this revolution. And it is a revolution and a very necessary one. You know, the pandemic, we've seen this spike of about 30% in mental illness. Now, this isn't anything necessarily new. There was always going to be a second pandemic, regardless of what's happened in the last year, of mental health issues. It's just accelerated it. All these factors such as loneliness, the crises we've been having, stress, it's just been an acceleration of a direction we've been naturally heading in and had to tackle. So we have seen in the last years this research into these psychedelic molecules and compounds, and with them, this shift in healthcare innovation. So we've got David Erritzoe today from Imperial College London. Welcome in person. He's a clinical senior lecturer in psychiatry at the Centre for Psychedelic Research, investigating brain mechanisms and therapeutic potential of molecules including MDMA, ketamine, and classical psychedelics. And he's also newly launched the first of its kind clinic inside the NHS to study this. And we have digitally here with us Lars Christian Wilde. Hello and welcome. He is the CBO and co-founder of Compass, a mental health care company pioneering mental health, and is behind a lot of psychedelic research and application. So keep your questions for the end. We're going to have about a 30-minute chat with David and Lars. And then I want to turn it to a discussion because and this is the place we're going to start, I realized coming into this talk is there is still a lot of confusion around psychedelic research. There's a lot of stigma, both from government. There's a lot of hype, both negative and positive. And we still have a way to go. So I think really that's where I'm going to start with you, David, if that's okay. And for the people here physically and digitally joining us, perhaps just explain, there has been this huge surge in psychedelic research. But what research is this? Sort of what molecules are you studying, and what is the potential success of these molecules?
Yeah, so thank you. When we speak specifically about the psychedelics, we tend to talk about the classic psychedelics, and they include the magic mushroom compound psilocybin, and also LSD that was invented during the Second World War in a lab in Switzerland, and then also mescaline and DMT, which is in this psychedelic brew called ayahuasca, but also exists and work alone. So those are the four classic psychedelics. Then sort of in the periphery and related compounds that you mentioned in the introduction, ketamine, MDMA, they're not classic psychedelics, but they're a bit related. They're part of this new treatment paradigm model where experience is part of the package, so to speak. So those are the drugs
So there's a huge range. And in terms of the research you're doing, I know there's a lot of comparison studies. What sort of mental health issues are you trying to tackle, and how are the results comparing to more traditional methods of tackling these issues?
Yeah, so over the last decade, as you mentioned, there has been this sort of new wave of psychedelic research coming back after having been lying dormant for decades. There was research and also clinical use in the 50s, 60s, and then not for decades, and now started again. And the main conditions that are being looked at, including by Compass, the company that Lars represents, is depression. So we have done a couple of trials, small pilot trials, and now more recently a little bit bigger trial, where we look at people with depression and what are the potential of these treatment paradigms in that context, together with sort of supportive therapy for depression. But it has also been tested in early sort of pilot work in addictions, alcohol, tobacco, and it's being scaled up and done on a larger scale now, also by more centers, both academic and companies. And then there's small work, a little bit of work done early in OCD, and we are going to launch a new study also in focusing specifically on OCD, and other studies are coming up. We just started an anorexia nervosa trial with psilocybin. That's the main compound being studied. It's quite convenient and a pleasant drug to work with, and so that's the one most focused on. But also DMT is being used. That's a more short-acting psychedelic. So the conditions, mainly depression, addictions, anxiety, end-of-life distress, have been studied really nicely by US colleagues, Johns Hopkins and in New York. So that's.
And I'm right in thinking, Arne, that sort of a lot of these things like the depression, there's the drug-resistant depression as well. So there's, these are life-changing studies for people. I think we live one sort of silver lining of the pandemic, I think, is that we have more of a conversation around mental illness now, more of a vocabulary and sort of a reduced stigma. And, the research that you are doing, and Lars, you're doing as well, it is life-changing for many, many people. And Lars, I'm going to bring you in now here as well, because of course, what we're going to see over the course of this session is that the research, cannot work in isolation. You're already working with research groups, both private and university funded around the world. So Lars, what's the entry point for your research? How does it sort of work with people like David?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Look, we're standing on the shoulder of giants, right? One is sitting right next to you. Obviously, David has been instrumental in many of the very widely publicized and published work of the past 10 years. Obviously, Imperial is clearly one of the leading institutions in this field. Now, where we come in is really take this great work and think about, what do we learn from these smaller studies? And then how do we work with the regulators in North America and in Europe to devise studies that allow us to go through regulated programs in phase 2B and phase 3 studies in the fastest way possible to bring that innovation to patients. You spoke about the growing crisis. One of the KPIs that we as a team have is that every 40 seconds, someone on this planet commits suicide. For every person that commits suicide, there are 40 people that unsuccessfully try, and that number is rapidly growing. That's what we're up against. That's why we said, look, let's not go back to the drawing board as standard pharmaceutical companies would do and come up with their own novel molecule. We said, look, the work that has been done with psilocybin is so intriguing. We need to take this forward as soon as possible to patients. So one of the studies that David's team was involved in at Imperial was the seminal study in treatment-resistant depression with 19 patients, and with phenomenal outcomes in that study. We took that data, we presented it to the regulators, which gave us FDA breakthrough therapy designation and allowed us to now run a big study with 216 patients in treatment-resistant depression in Canada, the US, and 8 European countries. That's going to be done by the end of this year. Hopefully, we're going to see similarly strong results as has been seen in the original program, and let us progress to phase 3 with it. If everything goes immensely well, we could be coming to market with psilocybin therapy for patients in 2024, 2025. Obviously, running clinical trials in a pandemic world is complex, but that is definitely our goal.
Yeah, and I think sort of I can see David, you nodding there. Do you think sort of 2024, 25 is realistic for some of these sort of molecules to be made more public?
That's what I have recently been saying as well. So I'm glad to have it confirmed, because I guess it's more in the hands in a way of the big trials. They're the trials needed in order for it to get the license. So yeah. I mean, it's sort of, and that's not far away. It's still a huge sort of number of leaps that has to be done. Am I correct? There are obstacles on all sides, from people like, I love my mother, but she finds this sort of research very hard to understand because of stigmas, social stigmas, things like that. And you have the public on one side and a lot of fear around these molecules. You have government on the other side. What sort of are the major barriers that you're facing right now? And I'm going to ask you both. I'm going to start, David, with you on your work. Is it more individual reactions to these molecules or sort of government barriers? I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. That I mean, the funny thing about psychedelics and the very fascinating thing is that there's kind of two things happening a bit in parallel. You have the medical model that in a way we represent here, both by studying them in a lab and running big trials in order to get them through the regulatory system. And as long as that is approved, we are allowed to do these studies, which was not possible for decades. At least now we have been allowed to do it because there are people in the right positions that can see this actually looks really promising and it's quite important to study. And then I think what happened with the cannabis story, to make that parallel, was that you had, if you asked people in the US about how cannabis should be legislated, there was a majority who thought this should be, illegal. And then there started coming some medical, results from science showing that they had a medicinal purpose or potential. Then it started shifting. So, and then politics starts shifting. So I think that if you show through science, I mean, without knowing what the results are, but if it looks really good and promising, and it's coming out there through events like this, and people kind of start being curious about it, reading up on it, seeing that this actually looks really interesting, then attitudes will change. And when populations' attitudes change, then politics change. I don't think you necessarily have to run around and hit the politicians on their heads and say, change the law. I think it will kind of naturally come. It has done to some degree for cannabis. And I think the same thing will happen here. Also, the way that it's regulated at the moment in most countries, they are sort of in the most sort of tightly regulated category where they have no medicinal purpose. That probably will have to be revised over the next years because it's kind of a bit wrong and meaningless if these results keep on showing what they do. So it will affect politics, I'm sure, eventually.
And I suppose that's the sort of the importance of everyone working together to prove as much as possible, to share results. And Lars, is that, obviously there's differences in different countries and different politics. Are you finding the same sort of barriers, or are there other barriers that you have? Because obviously you're trying to take these to market now.
Yeah, I think David summarized it really well. I think at the moment, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, there's a lot of hype around the prospects of psychedelic therapies, which is great to see, because I think what it speaks to is that there is a clear need, right? We see numbers and depression, anxiety disorder, OCD just exploding. Isolating people in their apartments and restraining them from being able to access their social network is a clear contributor that's really well understood psychologically for mental health suffering. So I think we created that perfect storm to actually make it even worse. So I think there's a COVID pandemic 2.0, which is the mental health wave or mental health suffering wave that's coming after it. Now, indeed, it's a bit more complex to run psychedelic studies than the average program in psychiatric development, where people take compounds to blunt their symptoms, because I think that is an important distinguishing factor here. When David and I speak about psychedelic therapy, we don't mean anything that's subperceptual, but we're actually dealing with large doses and therefore very intense experiences that patients are going through, which allows them to really work through oftentimes hidden traumas, situations of learned helplessness. They break through, they are able to recontextualize their lives. So they really get to the bottom of things. And that's connected with some very interesting mechanisms of action that these compounds have in terms of inducing neuroplasticity, reducing neuroinflammation, etc. So you have this condensed therapy within 6 hours, including then the integration, which is really important. That's something that I want to stress, because as David said, there's now also the tendencies to get into this hype loop in a way that you saw with cannabis, where then quickly in the United States, they went into some kind of gray market model where people could access it in some states semi-legally, later legally, or it was decriminalized. And eventually that stifled research quite a bit, because that led the funding flows into research to dry up. So unfortunately, cannabis is a highly under-researched field, despite all the explosion of economic activity in that space. I think the psychedelic therapy world is a bit different, because this is not something that, at least in the foreseeable futures, people will be doing on their own at home. But I think the work at Imperial shows how important the therapy is and the container, especially when we look at some of these patient stories. They really process deep-rooted biographical problems that need very skilled therapists to help integrate this experience. And that's really the focus that we're going through, is really making sure we can do this safely and create the efficacy required for approval. Now, what I believe is in the long run, hopefully we can move more to a model of prevention than treatment. So if we can show these treatments can be delivered safely at scale, and every little village has their own psychedelic treatment center, then there could be a world down the road in 10, 15 years where people could preventatively take these compounds to prevent from spiraling into deep depressive episode or from developing PTSD after a traumatic experience. But that takes us back to David's and my work. We need to generate the evidence first, and then regulation can follow.
Yeah, I think you're so right in that, we're still at, and this was a discussion we were having earlier, at the symptom treating stage, which, a lot of, the treatment that we have does that. It is treating the symptoms, and obviously it's a much more holistic problem, and there's the preventative. But it's an interesting point that you raised. I think that's really important, that it's integrated, isn't it? Every people, even the trials you do, it's not just a singular sort of dose or 2 doses of the psychedelics. It's in a whole treatment package. So what is that treatment package involve?
Yeah, and I think that's still gonna evolve. I mean, obviously we lean in this sort of Western way of testing it, also on the wisdom of other cultures, of generations, even for thousands of years of use of some of these compounds in a very intelligent way, several places in the world, particularly in South America. And I think it's not just so. No, in psychiatry, I mean, I am a psychiatrist. We're used to, when we prescribe something, here you have the drug. That's about it. It doesn't really come with a context, and it's either that or maybe talking therapies. Here we have this sort of, in a way, beautiful meeting point between talking therapy, psychology on one side, and then pharmacology, psychiatry on the other, and that needs to be integrated. And I think in a way both fields, I think, are ready. There's something interesting that happened over the last, several decades. You had the very analytical, psychological model with Freud and everybody who came after, and then a more cognitive approach. And now some of these models have been sophisticated, developed, and are more ready to actually, I think, meet this kind of thinking and treatment, where people need to be sort of psychologically prepared through some sessions before going into it. You need to have good therapists to identify who are these people, when are they ready, and how do you prepare, and how do you perfectly time it potentially. In trials, we are quite constrained by the limitations of a trial. Everything needs to be very protocolized, very much the same for everybody, but we still have these preparation sessions. And then the actual sessions, it's not just, take this compound and go home. It's in a very sort of safe and protected, supportive environment, where a lot of emphasis is put into the context setting of it. And then the therapists there, they are sort of supporting, guiding, not intervening too much in the actual sessions, where it's a lot about the experience and supporting it to be safe and to allow people to go and explore and go inside and sort of surrender to this experience and see what's in there. Typically quite a profound sense of meaning and insightfulness and great sense of connectedness, even nature relatedness, these kind of things that are very interesting and not typically built into our normal conventional treatment models. And then afterwards, with good therapists, again, what we call sort of integrating the experience psychologically. And I think depending on the patient, depending on the indication, the illness you are trying to treat, different psychological approaches and models will be tested. At the moment, we are, I think, both in the work that Lars and his colleagues are undertaking on the larger scale, and also in most of our trials, it's relatively stripped down to not be full of very, very sophisticated psychological models. There are some elements of some relevant, where we and the very good therapist involved believe that some elements of different therapies really fit in. So we do it in order to make it safe and to get to optimize it. But it will be more sophisticated and more advancedly tested in the future, when you could go a bit beyond a small trial, where you just have to let it be mainly led by the actual experience and then supporting that before and after.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of something that most people don't understand. There's a huge sort of package that comes around this and is ever evolving as well. And it's sort of, and Lars, I'm going to come back to you and your work in a second, but David, could you just sort of very quickly and briefly explain what is happening in people's actual brains, because you're a neurobiologist and you do imaging, when they're taking these molecules. And I sort of feel I should add, that I know there have been some trials come out recently that have only shown a sort of, small difference between that and regular medication. But regular medication you're taking, weekly, daily, continuously, and it's have, all these side effects. So what is happening in the brain when they take these molecules?
Yeah, before I'm going to ask that, actually, now that you mentioned that trial, because that's the trial from our group, and it's absolutely the headline and the abstract was very conservative, very cautious, and saying that it worked as well. But if you actually look at all the data from the trial, which sits in the paper, in the supplementary, a lot of it, the remission rate was actually twice as high. So it actually looked really, really strong. But I mean, obviously the whole package, everything around the actual drug was the same in the condition. So in a way, we probably also optimized the conventional SSRI treatment half of the study by having all that, obviously. But it actually did separate on a lot of outcomes in the positive direction for psilocybin. I think that's important to mention. What it does in the brain, I mean, the first studies we did, I think we did the first, of, hey, what's happening in the brain? What are the neural-brain correlates of the experience itself, and these sort of fascinating psychological things that I mentioned before, connectedness, all that. And what we see is this sort of quite sort of chaotic and extremely flexible brain state. And now there are results coming out, and we're going to test that in humans as well, whether we actually can induce, whether these compounds induce plasticity. Also interesting to look for ketamine as well, because we can see that in sort of preclinical models, but we are going to test it in humans more. And so you have these different functional networks that in a way are fine-tuned and optimized in order to meet the world, to understand ourselves and the world. So these different networks are active depending on what we're doing, and that's sort of from childhood to adulthood, being more and more sophisticated. In the acute state where you have a psychedelic experience, a full-blown psychological peak experience with these compounds that we believe is the very therapeutic element, we see a more sort of wild and chaotic to some degree, where some of the functional networks are broken down. Some of the in some conditions, very rigid connections between brain regions within some of these networks are broken down, and some of the networks even flowed into the other networks while the condition there. So that potentially also explains some of this experience that comes with a really full-blown psychedelic peak experience, where you feel that you almost cease to exist and float into the world around you, and feel this really almost sort of ego dissolution or insane sense of, not insane, that's the wrong term, but of connectedness with the world, with the universe, with others, with nature. And so you sort of go beyond yourself and your own sort of ego self reflected or into the network. And we can see some of the neurobiology, and it might allow for some of these models that we have in our brain, in our mind. It could be visual illusions, that we have an idea of how things should be, and the brain doesn't reinvent the wheel every time we perceive anything. It's held up against the models that we have through our experience, and then sometimes these models can be a bit rigid and unhealthy. It could be the people with a quite severe depression have a very negative self-image. Everything, no matter what happens around it, it's interpreted and understood, and the model is sort of reshaping the actual experience and perceptions as confirming this negative image. So some of these models need to be reshaped, and that's what we believe these profound experiences can do. So a little bit like inverse PTSD, that a profoundly meaningful experience can actually shape our brain function and our mind and psychology, and therefore having positive impact way beyond the pharmacological presence of the drugs. That's what is really, really fascinating for me as a psychiatrist, pharmacologist, that you have experience where the drug itself long gone, out of the brain, out of the body, but you still see the positive impact weeks, months after in a lot of the participants in these trials. And that's probably because it's in there and fiddling and reshaping some of these models we have of ourselves and of the world. and sort of pushing this sense of connectedness, and also personality traits like openness to other ideas and values. It's pushing that, and probably through this great flexibility and brain plasticity.
So that's phenomenal, really. And nothing can do that. By plasticity, if anyone's confused about the term, it's an incredible ability for the brain to grow new pathways, isn't it? And change those pathways that become habitual about thinking and models of the world. So I'm going to bring it to you, Lars, and say, so, we have this phenomenal effect that lasts, like you said, beyond just the actual molecule being in your body. So how do we make sure, now there's a sort of backlash about accessibility, and how do we bring this to market in a way that avoids the danger of exclusivity or, charging people ridiculous amounts? And what sort of mission that Compass is on in that vein?
Yeah, that's such an important point, because this is really how we started the company, trying to answer the question, if hundreds of millions of people on this planet are suffering with some type of mental health disorder, how do we make these treatments accessible? And so even before we started the company, we actually started to work with payer systems in Europe. So in 2016, we already seeked advice from the UK payer, the Dutch payer, and the Norwegian payer to figure out where is the need the highest, where they would be interested in actually reimbursing such a therapy. Now, the answer there was treatment-resistant depression originally, which means that roughly a third of patients that suffer with major depressive disorder do not respond to the first treatment attempts in the current episode of depression. So they progress to a state that is called treatment-resistant depression. Obviously, they're not resisting treatment. It just means it doesn't work for them. That's where we focused with the first program. We see some similar refractory patterns in all the other psychiatric indications, where some people do respond quite well to standard of care, which gets them over the hump of the issues they're facing, and then once they are out of the acute symptoms, they're actually able to work on themselves. But unfortunately, it doesn't work for a third of patients. That's where we're focused. In terms of our mission, we always said that we're all about accelerating patient access to evidence-based innovation in mental health. Obviously, psilocybin is such an innovative treatment coming forward. Now we have two models really in the pharmaceutical space in broad strokes. So in the past 30 years, I would say many pharma companies have adopted a model where they're trying to have a niche patient population, and they come in with extremely high prices for these patients. The alternative model is to treat as many patients as possible at affordable prices. The moderating or the limiting variable is the budget constraints that the payer systems, the insurances have. And that's why we're saying, look, we need to make this treatment as affordable as possible. And we've gone through payer advice in Europe with all the member states. We're doing something similar in the United States. We're working with the leading payers in the United States to understand what data do they need to see to actually reimburse psychedelic therapy. Now, why is that important? One might say, look, in the end, it's going to be a capsule with psilocybin. How expensive can that be? Obviously, it takes a lot of money to actually run these clinical trials. We need to recoup the investment in that. The other bit is this will be done by very skilled therapists, and they want to be paid. And so the therapy will have at least the cost of actually the overhead in terms of the space where the therapy is going to be delivered, and the psychedelic therapist. And if you think about, let's call it 2 hours of preparation and the actual session of 8 hours on a treatment day, and then a couple of integration sessions, that very quickly adds up to 12 to 15 hours of therapist time alone. Therapist hours 100 to 200, depending on where you are in the Western world, per hour. So that's very significant cost. And so we need to make sure that we can actually show that treating patients with this therapy has such an impact on the budgets of the payer institutions that they are going to reimburse this. Now, this seems very affordable because what we are seeing is that the average treatment-resistant depressed patient costs roughly $17,000 per year. That's a perpetuity cost at the moment because these patients do not improve. So we're quite hopeful that pending positive results, we will be able to show cost effectiveness.
And I think that reflected, like, obviously it is a battle that's going on in terms of the economy of this, the economics of this, and the battle going on around sort of stigmas in the research. And I suppose your work, David, in the NHS and this new clinic is showing that it's moving in the right direction. But before I sort of open it up to the audience, digital and physical, I sort of want to sort of just continue in that. This direction that it's moving does seem to be positive in terms of the work that you're doing, Lars, and the work that you're doing, David, within Imperial and now within the NHS. So what is on the horizon? You know, we're here looking towards the future at CogX. So what do you see on that horizon for psychedelics in your research?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, some of the work, the big trials, going to be deeply interesting to see. The MDMA is happening, and that's a bit ahead. MDMA for post-traumatic stress, really interesting. So that's hopefully coming, probably sort of breaking the wave in the way ketamine already came. And then hopefully psilocybin, it will hold through, and then it will be licensed. And I actually say, when we are talking about all the barriers, I will say that I think some of the barriers in a way have already been partly broken down. I think some of the regulatory authorities like FDA and EMA, the people who are sitting there, how do you that need to approve the pathway, how to run these trials, in a way they have understood, I would say, pretty early on, which I'm very happy about, that this is a different paradigm, and it's a little bit difficult to test it the same way as you would test a new pharmaceutical, new antibiotic, or a new mental health medication. So that's already really good. So that's why it's happening. Some of the work that we won't be answering from these trials would be, when do people need to be redosed? Could they be redosed with another, maybe short-acting psychedelic? DMT is a short-acting one. That might be interesting to test into the model. What about groups? Could it be even more valuable for people to be treated in groups and even have this preparation, this togetherness through the groups? That might be very interesting to test. What the psychological models, as I talked about earlier, all that needs to be figured out. And then obviously, selfishly, or I'm biased here by coming from the neuroscience side, where we are obviously really interested in understanding more about the mechanisms, also testing more indications. But how is it that this works? How is it that it's possible for it to have these quite long-term effects after single interventions? What's happening in the brain? How does that relate to these therapeutic outcomes, and getting even closer? Maybe this sort of thing that you relate to nature, you open up, you become connected. All that. What is the neurobiology behind that? Is there a learning into your sort of salient system, your reward system, that might be narrowed in a lot of these conditions, where it's sort of inverted state, very narrowed, where your brain in a way have been hijacked with thoughts or behaviors like addiction behaviors? Can that be broadened out, and can we measure that in the brain and understand the biology? It will also inform us about the brain, about these conditions more broadly. So these are really valuable tools, not only as therapeutic tools, but also as tools to understand consciousness better. We don't understand much about what consciousness is. Yeah. And also some of these brain mechanisms related to reward, related to learning, and then brain plasticity, and what role does that play for these drugs? So there's a lot to study.
I mean, I think, we're just at the start of this. And what's interesting for me is this sort of the way that we find a lot of sort of the ancient wisdom is coming back again, but now with sort of new technology and sort of robust scientific evidence-based work, which I'm conscious of time in this, so the last session today. So I want to open this up quickly to the floor to ask some questions, and digitally as well. So I've got an iPad here, and if the host could actually, I'm digitally backstage still, so I can't see the comments. So if you could just change that. And meanwhile, yes, who on the floor has a question? Yes, I'm going to take you. Put your hand up first. Yeah, go on, shout.
I'm wondering to what extent, if any, meditation and prayer goes into these protocols that you study, and particularly paired with the psychedelic trials that you're working on.
Not directly, but it does play a role in the sense that a lot of the participants, a lot of them, I mean, also to feel really ready for a psychedelic experience, often people come with the background of having been undergoing some meditation and want to make it, take it a step further to this sort of altered state of consciousness place that the psychedelic can really take. And so sometimes that's more outside of the trials. I think that's more people who seek these experiences maybe in a retreat somewhere, or maybe with their friends. So often it's linked with people seeking those practices. In some of our trials, we have seen that people afterwards become really interested in pursuing meditation. It's not integrated into our studies because it having multiple parameters in the trials when they are relatively small. It's very complex and difficult, and we'll just get super confused about the results and the data. But it definitely is an important thing. There's even a colleague, I think, in Oxford who compared some of what we see in neuroscience in these acute states with the psychedelics and related to what have been seen with deep meditation, different meditation practices that has also been studied with brain imaging. And there are some overlaps with some of these practices. And it is a popular thing for people who are attracted to or undergo an experience and get that sort of new meaning insight related to it to pursue meditation. Absolutely.
And Lars, is that something you've sort of incorporated or considered in a more holistic approach to your work as well?
It is a really good point, because I think one of the interesting studies that was done is at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, where long-term meditators have been randomized, and part of these Zen meditators have been given an active dose of psilocybin and others placebo, and they were asked kind of how they would speak about the state. And interestingly, when you look at it, not on the scales, but when you see the interviews afterwards, they said, look, this is one of the objectives why they are Zen monks and meditators, because they try to get into this state, which takes them years and years of work, and this felt somewhat of a shortcut to get to the same resolution. Now, I believe that when you look at our therapy model, which is very much mindfulness based, to embody the experience that people had during the psilocybin therapy session, there's some overlap with meditation. And as David said, we see actually that people oftentimes, after having had high dose psychedelic experiences, also adopt a meditation practice to remind themselves of the experience, to break free from their constant narrative in their minds. And in our trial, we have a partnership with a company that is leading in the field of meditation. So if our patients want to engage with meditation, they can. It's nothing that we push for. But I think this opens up for a broader question, as you said, right? This should be seen as a holistic treatment. I think David and I agree this is not the cure-at-all, and I don't think people should think about psychedelics as the magic bullet that patients do a couple times and they're forever cured from their mental health problems. But this should be part of the tool set of a broader arsenal. I think we shouldn't make the mistake to say that standard antidepressants are a thing of evil. I think they have a lot of utility for many patients. I think that's really important. And in the deep psychedelic community, you see some disregard of that, but I think they're very important. You mentioned meditation. There are other therapy approaches. There are behavioral approaches when you think about sleeping and sport, and just making sure people actually spend time with the activities that make them happy, with their circle of friends, etc. So indeed, that holistic approach will play an important role, and we're really encouraged by seeing some of the economic activity that where entrepreneurs, psychiatrists, psychologists, and other people are starting to set up treatment centers that are looking to integrate psychedelic therapies such as psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine. But they're also looking to integrate mindfulness-based practices, nutritional approaches, exercise approaches. And I think if you pull it all together, then you have a really powerful weapon against mental health suffering.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just totally agree on that point. And this idea of sort of things like what's known as socially prescribing, looking to what would have been seen as perhaps more alternative methods of therapy, we now realize all adds to this bigger picture. You know, and I should add, because there's a question that's come up here, you know, have people ever had adverse reactions to psychedelics? And I'm guessing the answer is yes. And some people won't be able to take them and may not want to. And so we need to have, like you say, Lars, a toolkit. What's interesting as well is that we've been asked sort of about the role that nature plays in the treatment you're testing. Now, you mentioned, of course, that it increases nature connectedness, which for people who don't know is how connected we feel to the natural world. And it also, that connection influences how likely we are to it's called pro-environmental behavior, sort of how likely we are to steward our own world and look after our own planet. Obviously, you're testing in a sort of lab where there's no nature at all. And traditionally, some of these molecules have been used, you know, out in nature in this very sort of calming environment. How do you counter for that?
Yeah, we would love to do it in nature because it makes a lot of sense, and that's where the wisdom comes from in that context. And but we do try to build a pleasant environment and try to bring in plants and so on if we're allowed to. Sometimes we're not allowed to have soil because it's in a hospital setting and so on. Then there have been some sort of real looking plants, which is not really the same thing. And I was a bit fearful that people might have a bad trip when it's a fake plant, but it seems to work. And then we also sort of decorate the room and with some sort of nature decorations as well, because it is an important component. People like looking at something that is alive and sort of link us back to nature. About the adverse events, I think it's super important. Obviously a good question. It has been very limited with severe stuff happening in all these trials. Now it has been quite a lot of trials worldwide, small scale, now bigger scale happening. And there will be some headaches. And the most common thing is sort of some degree of anxiety during the experience, because these experiences are not easy. I mean, it can be challenging and really, really profound states that people are taken into, and quite unpredictable what might come up. Some unconscious material might appear, difficult memories, emotions related to relations and so on might come through in these sessions, and therefore anxiety and some degree of distress in periods. Typically people break through it through these sort of 4 or 5 hours that when we talk about psilocybin works, and that's good. And we haven't seen that people have had sort of severe physical, they're physically very safe. So we haven't seen any severe apart from some headaches, which is sort of expected with some of these compounds, that they can produce some transient headaches. And in terms of sort of psychotic breakdowns, that we have not seen in these sort of very safely conducted trials, where we also screen out people with a history of psychosis or even with close relatives with psychosis, because we do not want to risk pushing anybody out there. But it hasn't been seen in these trials.
And I think sort of that's, and I'm conscious that we've come to time, and I think that's a really sort of important place to leave it. These trials, they're at the beginnings, but they are very, very much, showing such positive results, compared if you look at some of the adverse effects to SSRIs and things like that. And I think, thank you, David and Lars, for sharing both your work with us, because I think what I've definitely understood better through these sessions is the need for this collaborative approach, and it's very easy to villainize any side of this, from, pharmaceutical companies through to research itself. But actually, everybody that I've met on this journey, and I've been doing a lot of research and meeting a lot of people, has been working together for this positive outcome. And in the face of this huge challenge we have, to society in terms of mental health, to even the economics of the mental health crisis, the work that you're both doing is absolutely phenomenal. So I suggest to everybody, our physical audience and our digital audience, to look at both these people's work. I've got someone who's got their hand up. I have this really quick question. Can you answer really quickly in 2 sentences? Is he frozen?
Lars, could you hear it?
No, I couldn't hear. Oh, sorry. If it was from me, I could not hear the question at all. Sorry.
So because psilocybin exists in the real world, what is the IP when these are pre-existing molecules?
Yeah, no, great question. So we discovered a specific salt form of psilocybin, which we are protecting, and that we turned into a drug product. And so we protected the drug product and are taking this through regulation. So that's the IP protection. And then on the regulatory protection front is whoever develops any given therapeutic in a novel indication receives what is called data exclusivity from the regulators, which is up to 7.5 years in the United States and up to 11 years in Europe, which gives you protection from generic companies and gives us some protection from just people dumping psilocybin on the market initially. Which is a great tool, and so other companies are exploring that. Our friends at MAPS that are developing MDMA, we can talk about it for PTSD. They're also very much focused on the regulatory protection, which gives an incentive to actually do the work and recoup some of that investment.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Isaiah, thank you for that question, because it's something we didn't touch on. I mean, there's lots that we haven't had time to touch on. So check out both of the work of Lars and David. And thank you all who came here physically and have been here all day long. It's been so exciting. It's blown my mind to see this many people, and digitally as well. It's been really exciting to do a hybrid event. And thank you, Lars and David, for being here digitally, and also the amazing work that you guys have been doing, really important work. So thank you. And I'll hand over to the wonderful Deborah to say, thank you to everybody, and have a wonderful evening.